negative effects. So overall, probably at least a neutral effect, maybe even a slightly positive effect. Then the second example is one you know well. So Madrid, obviously in Spain, where there's been a big debate around Madrid Central, as you all know. And there was also a study done by a big Spanish bank that back then showed that there was actually an increase in retail takings. So it means that at least on Gran Via, there hasn't been a worsening of the situation, but on the contrary. And there's many more studies that we're going to also reference in our paper. So this is not cherry picking the few good examples. It doesn't mean that it will always be like this. It has always been like this. There are always cases where if you don't do it properly, you can see some negative effects, and we'll get to that a bit later. But it's definitely not a natural law that a low emission zone is bad for the economy. On the contrary, it can often be good. Over to you, Matteo.
Thanks, Jens. Yeah, some more, just to show some more evidences of what we were just talking about. Sometimes it's a matter of local businesses that actually overestimate the importance of car users. And what we mean by that is that sometimes when sort of surveyed, business owners tend to think that the majority of their customers would use cars to reach their trading shops. But actually, we found a few studies that actually do not confirm this, and in reality, they do pretty much overturn this this vision. So pretty much it can be the other way around. So more customers either getting to the shop walking or by bike. And sometimes there is also a different spending pattern. So while it might be true that with active travel, you would have smaller individual purchases. So that means that every customer that gets in the shop would maybe spend a bit less compared to the same customer if he got to the shop by car. It's also true that if through active travel, so again, walking and cycling, they tend to visit the shops more. So that means that at the end of the month, like if you do an average calculation, the overall spend actually increases because of this sort of combined effect of these two patterns that do change a bit. So again, that's another point that one might think as a given, like obviously by car people would spend more, but it's not the full picture, because yeah, they might spend more, but they might have less trips to the shops. So at the end of the day, maybe a person doing more shops, doing more trips to shop by bike is actually going to spend a bit more. And also some other studies, again, following the trend of the sort of increasing active mobility in certain areas, show that actually active travels leads to lower retail vacancy, meaning that those areas which have been implemented with active travel policies tend to have less empty or vacant shops. Which also means that in general, high streets of the main city centers are thriving a bit more, and the general improvement in economic benefits is definitely good. So next slide, please. And over to Jens again.
Thank you, Matteo. And so then we're coming to the end of this first section to give an opportunity to ask questions and have a discussion, of course. So what can we learn from these examples? And we selected a few that are particularly telling. For each of the arguments that we just made, there's several studies backing that up. And as we said, it's not a natural law that it will always be like this in every case. If you implement a very poorly communicated policy, for example, you may also see other effects, but it clearly shows that if you do it well, you can have a positive effect, so that you can boost the local economy if you do it well. Secondly, as Matteo just underlined, it's really important to understand and communicate that car use is often overestimated, especially by shop owners. They often use their own travel behavior, and they need vehicles more often to transport goods, for example, and they think everybody else is moving as they do, which is in several cities like London, Berlin, as Matteo said, it has been found to not be true. So much more people come by public transport, walking, which is also often underestimated, cycling, and so on. So car use is less important than you think, or than shop owners and restaurant owners often think. And as Matteo also showed, that overall, they're coming more frequently, spending a bit less per visit, but overall, usually spending more in the case studies that are available. So what we also need to keep in mind beyond what we already said is that there are studies showing that on days with high levels of air pollution, in this case, even for the example of Spain, a study by Yale University, they found that the spending in the local shops decreases if there's high levels of either ozone pollution or particulate matter pollution. In that case, this is the data they looked at. So it also tells you clean air is probably good for the economy because people don't like going to polluted city centers. And on days where you have high levels of pollution, probably they're going to do something else than walking through the streets of your city. Second point is that you should not, when we speak about a low emission zone, only think about vehicles. I think the idea is not to replace one vehicle by another, whatever powertrain you will use, because many of the problems around congestion, accidents, noise, and so on will not be eliminated. It's quite important to use that opportunity of a low emission zone to create space, because you still want to see a reduction in traffic. And we can see this, for example, in London, it's very clear. In Ghent, it's also very clear. We'll look at Ghent a bit later. So you can create space for people. And it's been shown, for example, in Bern, Switzerland, the capital of Switzerland, that the space that you create for people, for example, to park bikes per square meter, you have higher revenues because you can put just many more people into the same space. So there's a famous Austrian professor who 40 years ago said, when they were discussing pedestrianized zones in Vienna, he said, there's no other way to put as many people with their pockets full of money into the same square meters as creating a pedestrian zone. So it's basically a way of letting more consumers into your city centers. Obviously, we don't want to just increase overall consumption without any limits. I think probably most people also agree on this, but it shows that there is not a negative effect on the economy. You can manage this well. Finally, alternatives matter. So, of course, people still want to come to the city. And if you block everything and provide no good alternative, this will be difficult. So creating good infrastructure and services is really important. And there's the example of Naples in Italy, for example. They have 2 low emission zones, one in an area where the public transport system is seen as really bad. 100% of people saying this is not a good public transport system in our area. In the other area, it's only about half of the people seeing improvements as necessary. And there you can clearly see that the effect on the shops is very different. So it means you need to make sure people can come, which also means good walking infrastructure, also for people with reduced mobility, and good cycling infrastructure that is also safe. So to conclude, this first part is really, I think the main message is to say, if you do it well, you can generate positive effects. It has been shown many times. There's no reason why you should not be able to do it in Spain. But you need to provide really clarity and a clear path to zero emissions that people know what to expect. So we saw the zero emission zones a bit earlier. This is now a clear pattern that we see across Europe. We're not in a position for the climate and for the health reasons to just reduce emissions a bit here and there. We have to make huge efforts in the next years. And the good news from our presentation is that this will not destroy your local economy. On the contrary, it can really boost your jobs, your shops, your restaurants locally. And I think everybody thinking of sitting on a terrace, having a good coffee with clean air is probably much nicer than sitting in the terrace in the middle of traffic. So we'd like to stop here after that first part and see if you have any questions, reactions, and so on. We'd be really grateful for your contribution here as well.
Thank you, Matteo, Jens. I think there's no online questions, pero quizás aquí podemos comentar algo porque precisamente.
Okay, perhaps some of our participants have some question. It would seem like when it comes to low emission zones, that this fear that people have that the LEZs will have a negative impact on the local economy is the main myth we have to debunk. But I'd like to thank Jens and Matteo for their presentation. They've explained to us that that's actually not the case. So I'd like to open up the debate. This is nothing new, by the way. Reducing traffic seems to encourage people to get out and spend their money in the town center. That seems obvious, really, but again, that's not always the case. So let's start the debate. I'd like to give the floor to Jaime, councilman from Logroño. Good morning. As Carmen was saying, it's very important to talk about this. This is always the case whenever we're approaching a large-scale transformation, and whenever we talk about reducing traffic here in Spain, we always have to face this sort of rebellion from local business. They're afraid of taking a hit, so to speak. They seem to have this idea that people will simply stop shopping if traffic is reduced in town centers. There are some people that, granted, feel they need to double park their car if they have to buy something at local shops, but that's a small percentage of the population. But evidence has shown, as you said, that LEZs create a more enjoyable environment in general, which in turn encourages people to go to the town center and shop around. But the point is, how do we convince local businesses of this? Because we can provide them with evidence. We can tell them about positive experiences in other cities, but there are also negative examples out there, so to speak. There are cities where LEZs really didn't pay off for local businesses. So it's a sort of a evidence battle. Some evidence is positive, some evidence is negative. So my question is, how can we make sure that positive experiences are held in higher regard? In the case of Logroño, my hometown, a few important changes were introduced after the pandemic. Now, behavioral patterns have changed since the pandemic, and as a result, turnover for businesses seems to have decreased, and they're blaming it on low emission zones. There has been a 20% decrease in purchases, but that could be due to the pandemic. It's not necessarily directly related to the LEZ. As a matter of fact, we think if we hadn't introduced our LEZ, we believe that there would have been an even greater decrease in purchases in the town center. But we have to make the case for ourselves, and there is people are worried out there, and this is the great challenge. How do we convince them that this is the right thing to do? Because we have to keep on going forward, and I think as we go on, as we go ahead, history will prove us right. LEZs are one of the most useful tools. Thank you very much, Jaime. Over to Juan now with another question. Thank you. I think in pedestrian areas, one thing we appreciate is that local businesses have been replaced by franchises. That's a fact. Local businesses have disappeared, and in pedestrian areas or other areas that were recently pedestrianized, local businesses have disappeared and replaced by large businesses. How can we prevent that? Thank you, Juan. Okay. Hello, Jens Matteo. Would you like maybe to answer these two questions? Now, before you do, it is true, gentrification can be a bit of an issue. We talked about yesterday, as conditions improve within an area, there are some undesired side effects. Local businesses seem to disappear, precisely because pedestrian areas seem to attract larger businesses. Jens, Matteo, do you have anything to say in this regard? In cities, we have to plan out these actions, and we need to make sure that local businesses are protected. Jens, Matteo, over to you if you have something to say. Otherwise, we can move on.
No, I think we definitely would like to react to this. So thank you very much to the different questions. Also in the chat here online, I saw a good comment for the example of Sevilla, that actually before, in this case, pedestrianizing a street, there was a lot of resistance, and afterwards people were quite happy and now are asking for other streets to follow the same example. So I think that's quite interesting, and tells us something about often when you change something, people are afraid of this, but once it has happened and people see the effects, most of the time they're actually quite happy with that. Doesn't mean 100% of the people will always be happy, but overall the effect afterwards usually is very different, and people change also their perception of this. Now the concrete question from Jaime on what can we do, I think I would like to emphasize 3 points here. One is that we see across Europe that if we want to keep city centers attractive, we really need to work on creating an experience. You can order more easily and often also at a cheaper price if you go online and just buy everything there. And more people are doing this. And we see all the effects that also sometimes has on the environment and on the tax issues that we see with some of these companies and so on. So if we want to keep our city centers attractive, we need to make it a positive experience. And we see that often people combine going to a cafe, sitting down, eating, drinking, and going to a shop. Now in cities where it's almost impossible to find a nice spot to sit somewhere, you can really see that this is hard to create this experience. So I think the enemy here is not clean air policies, because people clearly feel like if it's very polluted, you don't want to take your family there on an afternoon, for example. You clearly want to go to a nice place where there's green, where it's not too dangerous to cross the street, where it's not too polluted, and so on. So I think we should really see creating an alternative to e-commerce as the main priority, and cleaner policies then are part of this. I also hear your point on gentrification, which to some extent can be linked also to policies that only cover certain areas of a city. If you do it just in one neighborhood, you could see the effect in that neighborhood. If you do it for the whole of a city, or maybe even a region in some cases, then the gentrification effect, because everybody will be concerned, is probably going to be lower. And also, I hear your point on smaller shops, sometimes finding it hard to compete on the main streets, on the high streets. And I think there, a low emission zone doesn't replace a good economic policy for these shops. So that's something we've seen before. And it's also something that we will continue to see as some of the big franchises, as also Juan said, they attract a lot of business. We also see examples where cities have succeeded in really keeping a lot of the smaller shops. So for example, if you go into the city center of Brussels, you can still also see a lot of the smaller local shops. And for example, in Ghent, we'll look at this in a few minutes. In Ghent, there was also a big movement from the smaller local shop owners that actually found a lot of value in the new policies that were put in place. That brings me to my second point. So how do you get them on board? I think clearly we've seen that you should work with them, really start very early speaking to the shop owners, the restaurant owners, and so on, business associations as well. And what we've seen, at least, for example, work in places like Germany and Belgium, is that you bring in what you could call ambassadors. So other shop owners who say, I come from this city. I was afraid myself that it would be really bad for my business. After all, it turned out to be quite positive. And these people are much more credible sometimes. So it can be worth organizing this exchange of experience, and of course also bringing the facts, but we all know that sometimes the facts alone are not enough. You also need to have a face and emotions behind this. Third and final point from my end, financial aid. It can be, as we also mentioned for Stockholm, that temporarily you need to somehow give people the opportunity to change their behavior, and you need to support shops during that time. So, for example, if you introduce a new policy, especially if you also do construction works, it might make sense to provide financial incentives to those shops and restaurants that really suffer from this, because, you know, for example, construction works in front of their place. And there, a certain financial aid to cover the difference between what they had before and what they're having now can make sense if the city can afford that. It's often not huge amounts, but it can have a huge impact on the acceptance of that policy. So these would be my comments. I think so. Creating an experience and not seeing clean air as in a position, but rather support. Secondly, bringing ambassadors and exchange of actual experiences to the table, and financial aid temporarily if need be. Matteo, do you want to add anything to this?
No, I think you pretty much covered all the points that I've been listening in the question. Thanks, Jens.
Well, then back to you, Carmen.
Pues muchas gracias por esta
Thank you very much. I suppose we can now move on to the second part of today's presentation, where Jens and Matteo from Clean Cities will be talking to us about previous experiences in mid-sized cities in Europe. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. So second part, and we've in part already touched on a few of these aspects. So we know that in Spain, there's now a big debate also about low emission zones in smaller and medium-sized cities. And often it's true that when people think about clean air policies, they think of London, Paris, and the likes. And they think, okay, it's a big issue in these big cities, but it's not for us. And we think that this is totally not the case because of the reasons that we're going to present to you now. So this part, we're going to keep it quite focused. First, look at, okay, are low emission zones suitable for small and medium-sized cities? Secondly, a closer look at two examples. Ghent in Belgium, a bit bigger, so medium-sized city, and Bolzano in Italy, a bit smaller. And look at, in our opinion, what are the lessons learned for Spain? So are low emission zones suitable for small and medium-sized cities? So indeed, this question is often brought up, and there's many arguments that are put forward why small and medium-sized cities are different. And then people sometimes claim that this means you cannot do the same policies there. So there's the argument around traffic flows. Is there maybe in smaller cities, people move differently, less traffic from the outside, less commuters, for example. Maybe also people are more car dependent sometimes in more rural areas.
Just a minute, because we don't receive the Spanish translation. And okay. Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let us know otherwise.
Sorry, you can continue, James, please.
Okay, thank you. So maybe I'll repeat the last point. So traffic flows. Are traffic flows different? This argument is often put forward. People are maybe more car dependent in more rural regions of the country and in smaller cities. Maybe you have less commuters driving in from the outside into the city. So that's one point. The second point, and all of this is a question for now, and I will try to answer it in a minute. Are the levels of air pollution maybe different? Like, is air pollution really an issue in small cities? Thirdly, enforcement. Can a smaller city really control the low emission zone, make sure people respect the law? Fourth, are there good alternatives? You don't have a metro system in smaller cities usually. Sometimes you have tramways, sometimes you have buses, but are they good enough to be an alternative? What's the impact on the budget? Can smaller cities afford to have these zones? Because it also takes a bit of administration, obviously. And are the mentalities actually ready for that? Are people somehow different in small and medium-sized cities than they are in big ones? So all these reasons are usually put forward. I think we should focus on three. So in my view, none of them are fundamentally different. Traffic flows, yes, they are somewhat different, but in many medium-sized cities, we also have the effect of being sort of a local regional capital where a lot of people commute to. We see somewhat higher car ownership, but it's not true in all parts of Europe for all of these cities. But this is something that you need to specifically take into account. So you definitely want to look at the traffic flows to better understand which area to cover in your low emission zone, and also what importance, for example, foreign cars play. In some cities, very famously, for example, Brussels, you have a lot of foreign cars. And if you don't include them, if there's no way to control them, because, for example, your system cannot capture foreign license plates, then you have an issue of justice, equity. So definitely you need to look at your traffic situation, adapt it a bit, but it doesn't mean that it's impossible. Levels of air pollution, we see that actually often the measurements are less good in the countryside. So on paper, you could think that small and medium-sized cities are less polluted, but when you do actual measurements, so for example, our German partners at DUH, they did a lot of measurements in smaller countries. And if you go to busy roads or busy parts of the town, you can see very similar levels of pollution for NO2 specifically. So it's a misconception, which is often linked to a lack of data more than an absence of a problem. Enforcement, it can also be done. We'll show you 2 examples where it's done by camera. You can also have your police force do it. That's another way of doing it. Alternatives to the car. This one, I think, definitely deserves more attention, because indeed, in some places, the public transport system and also the cycling and walking infrastructure can be less developed. So something to look at. And I can give you one example from Ghent in a minute. Budget, I don't think it's a major concern, because in the end, it's not a huge cost to the city, especially if you're clever about how you implement and enforce it. But the mentalities, indeed, I think there we need to communicate better why air pollution is not only a thing about big cities, and why also for small cities there is good examples, as we'll show you, and there's good reasons to go for a low emission zone. So I've been mentioning Ghent a couple of times because it's really an interesting example, I think. So you can see it on the top left. It's a very nice medieval city, a lot of famous Renaissance painters that were working there. A lot of beautiful churches. So if you ever go to Belgium, I think it's one of the nicest places to visit for sure. It's a medium-sized city, around 250,000 inhabitants, located a bit north of Brussels. So not exactly at the seaside, but halfway between Brussels and the sea. And although it's quite small, it has been having a lot of the issues that bigger cities have had for a while. So about 10 years ago, it had very high levels of air pollution, a lot of congestion everywhere in the city. Road safety wasn't great, a lot of noise. Public space was taken almost completely by cars. So it wasn't a very attractive place to live in, and it definitely didn't stand out among the other cities. But what they did then is 2 interesting things. One is a new traffic plan in 2017. You can see this in the image here in the middle. They created zones. And each of these zones corresponds to 1 or 2 neighborhoods, and you cannot drive through the city through these different zones. There's like red lines in between. And with a car, you cannot just jump from one to the other. If you want to go to another neighborhood, you go to the ring road a bit outside, you drive around, and you go into it from another end. So the through traffic has really been reduced, and people don't just drive through the city center anymore. You don't have these trucks and cars, who basically just want to go somewhere else in Belgium. They don't go through the city. And that has had a big impact on the quality of life. So if you look at the picture on the left, you can see so many people walking and cycling here. Before, these streets were super busy. Now there's almost no cars. There's buses, there's taxis, there's some cars for shops and so on. But people really got used to it. And at the beginning, once more, people were quite negative, some of them at least. There was a death threat against the mayor. When we spoke to him a while ago, he mentioned that. And eventually, when it was there, now it's one of the most popular places in Belgium, and people are really happy to go and live there. And so we saw a reduction in car ownership, and this was then combined with a low emission zone that has been effective now for roughly 2 years, which covers the whole city center. This is the part here in the graphic and the visual on the right. And they, at the same time, introduced a 30-kilometer speed limit to really slow down traffic, improve road safety, reduce noise, reduce pollution. And the zone is enforced 24/7, which isn't always the case in all cities. So that's quite important. At night, you cannot just ride through the city with your car and pollute as you want. And it's enforced by cameras at the borders, and also at these red sections here where you can cross from one zone to the other. If you cross that by car and you don't go around, then you will get a fee. Sounds a bit radical, but it's actually super effective and people now like it. So what's the effects of these policies? The Flemish media reported actually that it's been positive. So the examples of Ghent and also the other city in Flanders that took similar measures, Antwerp, they had a positive effect on the whole region of Flanders in Belgium. So it even went beyond the city, which is really important to keep in mind that it's not only about your small or medium-sized city, it's often about the region as well. In Ghent, they clearly saw that the cancer-causing soot particles were reduced by 52%. So they achieved this now instead of, according to the predictions, in 2027. So we have basically almost 7 years of cleaner air, much cleaner air, much lower risk of cancer. I think that's obviously a huge improvement. Nitrogen oxides were 26% lower, so roughly a fourth lower, than they would have been by 2025 without the low emission zone. So you already see a big effect there, and we all know that nitrogen oxide is really linked especially to diesel cars. And so the effect is that Ghent is booming, it's super attractive. There's a lot of shops that have opened also recently, and the shop owners, to link to our first topic, first weren't super convinced, some of them at least. Later on now, it's really a booming city. A lot of new people are moving there. Air pollution has really been reduced, and importantly also outside the city center. So when I showed you this graph here with people driving around, maybe the first thought you had was, okay, so the pollution is going to the other parts of the city, so gentrification in some sense. But actually, no, it has been shown that the NO2 pollution has remained stable at all the measurement stations. So the city did a big campaign on this to measure the air pollution, and it hasn't been pushed elsewhere. It's really that traffic has been reduced and pollution has been reduced. So that's super important to stress. And Ghent also has some interesting examples of what you can do. They have mini shuttles, so small buses inside the city. People with reduced mobility can get on those easily, go from A to B. So they don't suffer from the lack of being able to go by car because they can still move around. There's also interesting car sharing schemes. If you buy a cleaner car, you can get a premium from the government and the local authorities, but you only get the high amounts if you share your car with your neighbors. So there's an online system, you register your car, you have to prove that I think it's more than 50% of the kilometers are being shared with others, so that you only get the money for cleaner cars if you make sure that it's also shared the maximum amount. And there was also something like the no car premium, which is people getting rid of their car. They get, in that case, circa 500 euros to spend it on something else, for example, to buy a bike. So that's really an example that has attracted a lot of interest in Belgium and beyond. And the people who put this in place have also been re-elected. So it's also been politically quite a success. It's not that people then afterwards thought, oh, we need to go back, on the contrary. So now to the next example of Bolzano in Italy. Matteo?
Thanks, Jens. Yeah, we just wanted to also bring the example of Bolzano because it's a slightly smaller city compared to Ghent. So we are talking about a bit more than 100K inhabitants throughout the year, and it's a very famous spot, sort of touristic spot for those people that go to Italy for the mountainside, so to say, because obviously it's at the feet of the most famous Dolomites, which are again a very, very great spot for either skiing or hiking or general sort of adventures that you can have in the nature and the wild nature. And it's located in the far north of Italy, so it's almost at the border in this area which once belonged to actually Austria. So it's been I would say a part of the country that has been changing quite radically and drastically over the last century or two. Obviously, again, a city like this, which is not big per se, could just sort of, and also is also a touristic spot, could just one might think that they wouldn't have to struggle with the same problems of bigger cities like in Italy, for example, such as Turin, Rome, Milan. But they actually noticed that there were quite high levels of air pollution a few years ago, and they really wanted to invert the trend. So one of the measures that they took was to introduce an LEZ right in the city center, which is very strict for most vehicles, and it's obviously enforced by cameras, and it's active throughout the year. Initially, they've implemented only a winter LEZ because, again, Bolzano is very famous for the Christmas market, so there would and obviously there would be a sort of a one of the main destinations during winter. So they started just with a winter one, but then they extended the measure because actually it proved to be quite effective in reducing traffic in general, and also the air quality measurements showed a drastic decrease of pollutants such as PM10 and 2.5, and also of NO2. So the local council decided that they wanted to keep the LEZ, and again, this is something that obviously it's been a good example of even sort of implementing a measure in a city that is not necessarily as big as other main cities in Italy, can still have a lot of great effects to the area. Some of the sort of complementary measures that they were applied to people, for the people of the area, obviously some kind of grants and bonuses. For example, the bonus to change or switch your car to electric vehicles, and in general to implement new charging stations for, again, boosting the usage of these vehicles. And I think another interesting point, which was sort of promoted by the local council, was that a bonus for freight transportation, because Bolzano is also very close to the Brennero tunnel. Brennero is one of the main freight routes in Europe because it goes through the Alps and connects pretty much Italy to the rest of Europe. So it's one of the main channels in which Italy exports and imports most of the freight. So another initiative was to grant some kind of tax breaks for those that would switch to fully road transport freight to partly, or at least mostly, rail freight transport. So basically, instead of just transporting your goods on vehicles, if one could actually move part of that onto rail, that would still have some advantages, like tax advantages and breaks. So again, I think this shows that pretty much even smaller cities can take ambitious initiatives and have great results on the medium and long term. And over to Jens again.
Thank you, Matteo. So we're coming to the end of the second part, to also leave some time for questions. So we know you're discussing very similar topics for Spain, and hopefully these two examples encourage you to say, well, it's totally possible. There's no reason why small or medium-sized cities are that different. Of course, you have to take into account differences, but you shouldn't shy away from taking action. So there's no reason why it shouldn't work in these cities. And the citizens definitely must better understand that air pollution is also a problem in many small and medium-sized cities. And I know that also ecologistas are doing a great job with their annual report to show that there is really a lot of hotspots of pollution, and a large share of our population in Europe is exposed to levels that are considered toxic. So you cannot copy-paste solutions for major cities and not just take them one-to-one, but the principles are pretty similar. So as you've seen for these two cities, it's not like you have to completely review the way you do a low emission zone. So we think that it's quite important to really look at providing alternatives, which on the one hand can be harder for public transport, yes, but it can also be easier when it comes to walking and cycling in a smaller city. So there's also quite some opportunities to really make sure that you have a switch to cleaner modes or cleaner ways of moving around. And as I mentioned earlier, the surrounding region might also require special attention. They will probably benefit from this, but you also need to make sure that the people who need to come to your city have alternatives to move. So that, for example, brings in the example of trains. And I think on that note, we would like to thank you and see if there's any questions, comments, and so on. So thank you very much for having us. Thank you for your attention.
Pues muchas gracias, Jens y Matteo.
Thank you, Jens and Matteo. It's a pity that the camera's not working, so we can't see you, but would anybody like to make any questions to our speakers? Anyone who's here or anyone who's connected via Zoom? Juan. Thank you. It's comforting see that there are examples of using different types of transport, trams, bikes, people walking, seeing how they can all be used together in Ghent, in this fantastic medieval area that we heard about there. For example, as well, the use of trams in cities like Zaragoza in Spain, which initially caused problems between different politicians who were arguing about it, and there were different levels of aggressiveness in terms of debating this issue. But sometimes the different proposals for transport can actually bring people together, as we've seen in the case of Ghent, and this is great to see. And these are examples that we really need to get out there to people to show that the message is positive and that we can give good images. When we look at Madrid and other big cities, if you look at the center of Madrid in the 20s of the last century, for example, and you look at there were horse-drawn vehicles still with some cars, and you can see how radically things have changed over just one century. Thank you. Thank you, Juan. I have two very specific questions. I don't know if I understood in terms of traffic restrictions in Ghent and in Bolzano. It doesn't necessarily depend on the type of vehicle, but it's a blanket restriction for all vehicle types. It doesn't matter whether they're more modern types or hybrid types or other types. I don't know if I understood the question correctly. In Ghent, also, the payment of 500 euros on a yearly basis was for people who can show that they don't have a care. Was that correct? Can you answer those questions, please?
Yes, let me try to answer those. And thank you also, Juan, for the positive feedback. So when it comes to the blanket restrictions, what we need to understand is that in Ghent, you have both. You have a traffic plan that restricts car use overall and encourages walking, cycling, public transport. And on top of this, they also have a low emission zone. So there's less cars, and the cars that can still come, they have to comply with certain criteria, so be less polluting or not polluting at all. And that's something that has proven effective to go beyond the effects that they first saw with the traffic plan alone. So it's a bit of both, and I think it's a good example that a low emission zone alone is maybe not the most efficient way of doing it. You should also combine it with a general overhaul of how you use public space. And everybody who walks through the streets of Ghent today will immediately recognize the benefits. And it's just a complete change of quality of life. And you don't have to be worried about your kids being run over by a car and so on. And importantly, it's also not only about the city center. So indeed, the medieval city center is an important part, the core of this, but also the other parts of the city center are concerned by the low emission zone, and the benefits spill beyond that. The second question on the benefits, the 500 euros. So in that case, there was, if you give up your car, if you hand in your license plate, so to say, you get cash. We see this in many other cities as well. For example, in Brussels, we have a similar scheme. So you can get, for example, a public transport pass for a year or two, or you can use the money to buy an e-bike and so on. I think there's definitely a point to be made to say you should not only give it to people who give up their car, which is obviously a good change, but you should also give it to people who never owned a car. So there's a big debate currently in Berlin, for example, where they say we want to basically have a budget for everybody who doesn't own a car, because it saves a lot of money. You don't need parking spaces for them, no air pollution, less congestion, less noise, and everything else. So if you sum that up, that's a few thousand euros per year in costs for society usually. Estimations show something between 2,000 and 4,000 euros, depending on where you are. And the idea of some initiatives is to say people who don't own a car, so don't create these costs to society, they get money. And then they can spend this on walking, cycling, public transport, whatever they want. So if they want to buy a new hiking shoes, great. If they want to buy a bike or public transport pass or whatever, perfect. Or maybe even use shared services and maybe a taxi every now and then. Why not as part of public transport if that's the best choice. So I think these are ways of dealing with that, and I hope I answered your questions, Carmen.
¿Teníamos una pregunta más, Pilar?
I think there is one more question. I have a question about restrictions for lorries and vans. I'm not sure if I got it right. Are you trying to replace basically lorries and vans with the railway? Are there subsidies for this? I would like you to expand on that if possible, because it seemed very interesting.
Yes, of course, and Matteo can add to the Italian example. So I think freight transport is often a bit outside of the focus of discussions because people care more about private cars and all of this. But we also know that, especially with what we discussed earlier, e-commerce, there's more and more delivery vans and also trucks in cities. And that's obviously a big issue for air pollution often, but also for road safety and for noise. Sometimes these vehicles to unload, for example, they block cycleways and they block also footpaths. So it's quite important to tackle those. Interestingly, in Ghent, they did find a good solution. They created a new company with very small trucks, cargo bikes, and also other bigger electric trucks. And it's been so successful that the Belgian Post then bought it afterwards. So they've since purchased the whole company. It's called Bubble Post. And they really had a more general logistics scheme for the city with a freight hub a bit outside, micro distribution with small vehicles in the city and the trucks a bit more outside. And train can play a role in this. So I think in many countries, we currently have a premium for companies that shift from trucks to rail. I definitely know, for example, that it's true in Germany that there is a financial incentive if you move to combined transport. So you drive your truck to the next logistics hub, put your container on the train, and then do maybe the last mile again with a truck if need be. So there's financial incentives for this, also approved by the European Commission as a subsidy that's permitted. And obviously that is interesting. And I think also for cities, obviously, you can't transport things by train within the city in many cases. But there are cities like, for example, Dresden in Germany, where you use the tramway to deliver freight. So, for example, for a car manufacturing company, they transport things in a special tramway. So that also shows some potential there. It's a bit exotic, but it's totally feasible. It's economic and it works. Matteo, do you want to add anything for the Italian example?
Yes, just quickly. Basically, yeah, it's for Bolzano. What we need to consider is pretty much the fact that really is geographically is located very near to one of the main logistic sort of hotspots of Italy, which again is the Brennero Tunnel, and that means that basically a lot of the freight either transit through Bolzano or got very close, and obviously a lot of these freights and goods do get transported by either cars or well, obviously lorries. So that means that even taking out some of those lorries to be replaced by sort of rail freight means that the highways passing really close to the city are going to have some sort of units of traffic reductions, because obviously you would still switch part of that traffic to rail, and that so is why the city itself took the initiative to say, okay, let's introduce these tax breaks, because of the fact that it's really located on a corridor, and so any sort of change to even freight transport can be really beneficial for them. Not necessarily going to the last mile delivery. Obviously, like switching that to rail wouldn't be necessarily realistic, but even for bigger transport of tons of goods, it's still something that's going to have a direct impact on the city because of its geographical position. Hope that is clear.
So I think back to you, Carmen, and we're mindful of time. So I think on our end, we've said everything we wanted to say. So we'll let you decide how you want to carry on.